everybody, wait a minute.
I mix what I like, what I like.
I mix what I like is exactly where you want and need to be. I mix what I like, organic, vegan, soul food from your immediate diet. Live healthy. Live healthy.
I mix what I like, what I like.
I mix what I like is exactly where you want and need to be. I mix what I like, organic, vegan, soul food from your immediate diet. Live healthy. Live healthy.
I mix what I like, what I
We're
like.
here on I Mix What I Like. You may check us out on imixwhatilike.org, where you can see all these other shows and what my daddy liked and other cool things.
Yes. A little bit of a little error there on the intro, but nonetheless, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Might Mix. Goodness gracious. It's not even Monday morning for me. This is pre-recorded. But welcome everybody to another edition. What's up, world? Welcome everybody to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here on Black Liberation Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host. A little bit of a rough start, I must say. But we're going to keep pressing through. Again, welcome everybody to Black Liberation Media. Please like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon. Got things unplugging, falling over. And you would think I would be more prepared given, again, I'm pre-recording this. So, but nonetheless, again, we're not stopping. We're just going to press through and it'll give that live Monday morning effect. I hope you all are having as good a Monday and will have as good a week as possible, given the context. I'm on my way to my 4-4, happily on my way to my 4-4. And very much also happy to be extending our weekly series, 100 Years of Malcolm X. This is part 6, where we're going to focus on Spike Lee's film, at least a little bit, media and some scholarship and overlap there. Again, big shout out to whom this goes the credit for inspiration for this series.
You don't read, beloved.
And salute to him and everybody. Welcome to all those joining us in the chat. Do come on in and be polite by, again, like, sharing, and subscribing. Make sure you have the bell rung so you don't miss anything that has been offered. Please go back and check whatever you missed over the weekend, including Saturdays with Renee, featuring a discussion with Davon Love of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Please do check all of that out. All right. So without further ado, I started out thinking I might do a couple of different things, and I might come back to some of those in successive weeks. But as I just started to look at, as I've said before, sometimes I just like to peruse databases and see what's being written, and just get an idea, get kind of maybe inspired or intrigued just by some abstracts and titles. And And so I thought I would do that in terms of, looking at what's been written over the years and continually about Malcolm X. And a lot of there's been a lot. He continues to be a very popular subject, and rightfully so. And I found a couple of pieces that I thought would be very interesting to host a conversation to get us started here on a Monday morning, and and continuing this ongoing series, looking at Malcolm X. By the way, just real quick, shout out to everybody who joined me on for my Saturday Night Live, and who got a kick out of our attempt at a cold open. And by the way, if you notice, my little 00 African crew that encouraged that was right. So first of all, we were right that the actual Saturday Night Live would open their show with reference to the Signal scandal. It makes sense. So we predicted that correctly. And if I think pound for pound, if you calibrate or scale for or what's the word I'm looking for? Adjust for resources, time, skill sets, amounts of people involved, I think ours was actually better. So, but there was another slight little extended reverberation from Saturday night, which involves a very interesting discussion with the comedian Godfrey's podcast co-host, sometime podcast co-host Dante Nero, with whom I spoke briefly over the weekend. Good dude, appreciate him being willing to discuss some things, and because I told him that and shared with him that I did a little response to some of their recent discussion about Black ownership, economics, business, and comedy clubs, and thought that their conversation did a lot to support a lot of my own arguments and some others, but also show some of the contradictions. So we chopped it up a little bit. It was a very interesting discussion, and I hope there's more of it. So that was fun. But the scooping the real Saturday Night Live on the cold open, I got a kick out of that. That was kind of cool. So, but all right, to the business. So, as I said, I just a few articles here, and then went back and found something that I thought was very interesting that was written in the Washington Post about the Spike Lee film that I'll wrap up with. That was written at the time, or just before, or actually before Spike even started filming, and was very reminiscent of the legendary and classic debate and Cinque Brath. I got to get this worked out where I can get this audio, if not the video, from this. But we'll come back to that. So I'll start here with. Oh, wait a minute. Can we do it this way? From my computer. Okay. So if I didn't even notice. So StreamYard apparently is upgraded a little bit here. Salute. And let's see. So so if I find it here and open this here. And while this is processing the PDF, please do like, share, subscribe. And again, peace and welcome everybody, especially the undefeated chat and who are here live. And to those who will see and hear this later, peace and welcome to you as well. And maybe we'll just go to the old school format, given how long this is apparently taking. Up. Hey. No. There we go. So this is from, and I won't say that I read the entire dissertation. You know what? This isn't going to work. Okay, this isn't StreamYard's fault, but this is just because of the way I have my situation set up. That's not going to work. So we'll just go to the old school way of doing it. Because I gotta be able to skip around a little more easily. So from the University of Melbourne Media and Communication Program, Nash Petropoulos, a minor thesis presented to the School of Culture and Communication for the master's program back in 2010. The mediaization of Black nationalist Malcolm X, a critical engagement with the conditions that enabled his transformation to an all-American hero through the analysis of the hate that hate produced and Malcolm X. Now, again, as I said, I'm not reading the entire thing here, so I just skipped around a little bit, and for our purposes here, I'm moving ahead to this section. Malcolm X as a commodified trademark and the Trojan horse of inclusion, because it makes so many of the points, and it summarizes a lot of what the argument is around the hate that hate produced and Malcolm X, another the film. And without, again, I didn't read it all, and there's a lot there, but without getting so. Therefore not getting into it, it does, I think this section summarizes the approach and makes some very interesting points that I think overlap with some that I think should be made and have made and look to want to emphasize. So it also reminded me again of my literally the first assignment with Black Agenda Report, where I was asked to go to the National Press Club to review a press conference of the then up and coming Cory Booker, who had run what Martin Kilson at the time, Black historian out of Harvard University, working with Black Agenda at the time, what Martin Kilson was calling at the time the Trojan horse candidate. And of course, the Trojan horse candidate being someone who looks like you, looks like a gift to you, looks like someone who would be supportive of you and coming from your community, but who is in fact carrying within it a very diabolical content, dangerous content, a threat to your civilization. So in this case, that would be, well, in the case that I was talking about, it would be Cory Booker presenting himself as some sort of an advance, but carrying a very neoliberal politic. And then here, much of the same is being said about the film and about the hate that hate produced, and the attempt to reset the way the state would prefer Malcolm be considered, if remembered at all. So in discussing this, the symbol of the X and its deployment in Spike Lee's film and other media. The argument here is that it starts to again rebrand the symbol of or rebrand what we're supposed to think of when we think of Malcolm X. The X symbol at the very end of the film, that is Spike Lee's, becomes a commercial trademark that, as Coombe argues, undergoes new media mutations. It is the constancy and unpredictability of these media mutations that lead us to reflect upon Lacau and Mouffe. According to them, society is a complex discursive entity that cannot be reduced to a dissectable machine whose internal functions and equilibrium cannot be clearly defined and calculated. The X symbol does not come full circle, but on the contrary, assumes a new meaning. As shown in the analysis, Malcolm X is reduced to a mere T-shirt stamp that can be infinitely reproduced, while in the process, Malcolm X's widely disputed legacy becomes flattened to form the stamp mold from which all these T-shirts will be produced. I think that's a fascinating metaphor and an appropriate one. And again, one that reminds me, of I think I've shared the story being in the Navy and his brother. We were about, and the late great my homeboy Kwame Ture, Kwame Nkrumah, named after, of course, Kwame Nkrumah, and me, he and I and this other one of his somebody he used to hang out with that I just was, and we're about to go. And I remember the day very well because we were on our way to see Rare Essence perform at Hampton University, and he comes out wearing an X shirt. This third brother, not Kwame, and I had a little conflict with him because I was like, man, you can't wear an X shirt. I was like, you don't even know what that means, and he admitted. He said, I don't give a fuck what it means. It's a nice shirt. I don't care. I'm going to, see some, see some of the wiggle that we see at the Rare Essence show. I'm not worried. And I was like, that's disrespectful. I think you should change. And he was like, he said, F you, I'm not changing. And I was like, well, F you too. And then we ended up going to the show. But what I was caught up in the moment was what is being written about here. Not an X symbol coming back full circle to represent and inspire a Malcolm X inspired or politicized movement, but one where it just becomes any other commodified, sellable, marketable logo that represents maybe vaguely something Black and positive, but certainly is not at all meant and doesn't at all need to be connected to anything more meaningful than that, where it becomes flattened. What Bell Hooks identifies as appropriation and invasion of Black culture, veiled as the promise of recognition and reconciliation, is evident in the scene where the key Black nationalist figures parade one after another to convey a certain unity of Black nationalism. The discourse of recognition and reconciliation is what I think they meant to write here, in a way becomes the Trojan horse for the cultural appropriation of African-American culture. What is omitted in the 90s is the lack of political struggles that would use the figure to promote the agenda of a more politically active African-American, of more politically active African-Americans, rather than sit idly by and witness the appropriation of even the most militant aspects of the Black nationalist tradition. So again, as I interpret this, it's again reflective in the experience that I just summarized, that because there was no movement properly organized in that time, certainly that I would have been connected to, that could have assured that this appropriation could not take place, it takes place and then appropriates the most militant aspects of Black nationalism and reduces them to, it's just a fly shirt that I'm going to wear to another go cookout event. And it's interesting because we're going to come back to the issue of Spike Lee's film, and then also to what something that Bell Hooks has written about Spike's film as well. So it's appropriate that we sort of start there. I thought they did a good job. I like this part here where there's some context to that time period. In fact, one of the other articles that we'll look at does this even better. As the end of the 80s saw the collapse of the USSR the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War that marked the beginning of an unchallenged Pax Americana. The market dynamics have become a global force inextricably linked to the American ideological hegemonic structures. So this is actually a good point, and something that I should probably revisit in some of my own work. That I talk a lot about the post Second World War and even the Nixonian moment, but this time period is one that deserves more attention as well. And I forgot who was the scholar or a set of scholars that have said that about this time period of the 80s and 90s doesn't get enough study, but this it's largely the same point, that the Cold War that began after the Second World War was certainly inflamed and in full swing by in the 1980s as well. And it's perfect if the United States can co-opt a Malcolm X symbol, commodify it, and project it to the world as an American success story, which is what the film certainly by its end does, with the X symbol burning into an American flag. In the aftermath of the Watts riots and through the film about one of Black nationalism's most iconic figures, white cultural imperialism managed almost effortlessly to absorb the entire Black nationalism movement, and as Bell Hooks argued, and as I argue, absorb the racial tensions the Rodney King incident brought about. So it's also important, I think this is important as well, to remember that Spike Lee's movie came around at a time of not only the 80s and the Cold War, but right after the 80s and the Cold War, but right after the Rodney King beating, where there was a so-called riot and uprising, and there was a renewed conversation around where you would see white folks on news. Why are they so angry? I didn't know. They're so angry. The enabling conditions examined throughout this thesis have been the socio-political context through which Malcolm X, the anti-American Black nationalist, was examined, and the cultural commodification of Malcolm X into a corporate trademark. As this analysis indicated, it was quite a leap for Malcolm X's figure in the 1990s to become widely considered as an American hero, when less than 40 years ago, he was considered the charismatic leader of an anti-American Black supremacy movement, as Essene Odum wrote. So this is, again, I think an important. So as I've said before, when I the Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance is again just a somewhat. Oh, wait, there was one more, but it's somewhat of an oversimplification of a culmination of a lot of research similar to what we were just reading here, that makes a lot of, again, similar arguments about the impact of these images in promoting what as I'm paraphrasing and putting my own spin on what this author is concluding here, the semiotic democracy that others have argued for and want to believe exist. And this is why I wrote in my note here, this is why Richard Wolff's point about democracy not existing in the workplace is a very important one, because so, when I used to engage the media reform movement and just have argued in general, media won't change society. So much like the argument around technology, media production won't be enough to change society. You can't film and podcast our way into revolution. So one way to sort of check, and again, in another way of addressing the Vernon philosophy, one way to check any of our tendencies to like what we're watching or to appreciate the media environment that's being provided to us, it should be considered in light of what Richard Wolff has said about finding unionization or democracy in the workplace. And of course, we don't. So given that the workplace is the dominant institution and social organizational tool, if we lived in a democracy, we would see democracy in the workplace. And the fact that we don't see democracy in the workplace should inform us about what kind of society this actually is. And I would argue the same thing about media, that we're invited, and what this thesis is arguing, again in my words, is, or seems to be arguing, given what little I've read, this section that I read, and then a little bit more of it, and then this conclusion, is that we're invited to this belief that we live in a semiotic democracy, that is a society of free and equal exchange of ideas and symbols and messages and narratives. But we don't. What we have, again, my words, is a colonial society in which media colonize narratives and symbols, and it's semiotic warfare, not democracy. So when we see a film like Malcolm X from Spike Lee, or really pretty much anything else, we have to understand it in that context. It's a commodified version. It's a Trojan horse version of Malcolm, one that's meant to look like a gift, but is actually what allows us to invite in the hostility, to welcome in the enemy. So, and in fact, what I had meant to do at the start of that, in terms of the summary, was to just read with you the abstract. In the aftermath of the end of the Cold War, the ideological restructuring that took place fundamentally affected the representation of one of the African American public figures of the 1970s that was portrayed as deviant by the media, and yet up until that time enjoyed relative obscurity. So that is Malcolm X. So Malcolm X was relatively obscure and negatively portrayed as deviant up until we get Spike Lee's biopic. Interest in his figure was rekindled, albeit in an entirely new direction, after the Watts riots of 1992. Due to this shift, a cultural commodification of his figure undermined the subversiveness of his message. There is need for extensive discussion to reconceptualize the subtle reinforcement of hegemonic structures in the mediation process and address the political context and in the commodification of Malcolm X. This thesis applies the notion of mediatization of the figure of Malcolm X on film and television as analyzed through the lens of cultural commodification. So, right on. So continuing on in that similar vein, and speaking of bell hooks, as was done a moment ago, there is this article I found called "Male Heroes and Female Objects: Sexism in Spike Lee's Film" by Bell Hooks in Cineast from March of 1993. I don't think I'm pronouncing that correctly, and we'll come back to this journal in a moment. As it says here, the abstract discusses sexism in Spike Lee's film Malcolm X, Lee's creative talent in portraying Black masculinity through complex and diverse portraits, Lee's stereotypical representation of Afro-American women in his films, Lee's portrayal of Nola Darling and She's Gotta Have It, Lee's depiction of Malcolm X's involvement with a white woman, major gaps in Lee's fictive portrayal of Malcolm's life. So, yeah, and I understand, just for the record, I understand there's a lot of argument and debate about Bell Hooks, her relationship to Black nationalism and her hostility towards Black nationalism. et cetera and so forth. But I have always enjoyed her media criticism, and I thought this one was also very interesting. And it leads into some of the criticism we're going to read about the film of Spike Lee before it actually came out, that echo some of these sentiments, including this one here, where Hooks writes that anyone who has studied Malcolm X's life and work knows that no one has considered his involvement with white women as the high point of his career, as small of his career as small-time pimp and hustler. Yet it is this involvement that most captures Spike's imagination, so much that almost half of the film focuses on Malcolm's relationship with a white woman named Sophia. So I don't remember it being that much of the film, but I do remember that there's there's just a lot of time we get with Malcolm and Sophia that is unnecessary to a film about Malcolm's life, especially when you would need much more time for not only Malcolm's life, but his relationship with Betty. But I also thought what Hooks says here about Sophia is very interesting, that like younger Malcolm, the real life Sophia was a hustler, not the portrait of an innocent little girl trapped in a woman's body, which Lee gives viewers. It was disturbing to see Lee's version of Malcolm's life begin with and focus centrally on his lust for white female bodies, but it was even more disturbing that this relationship was portrayed as yet another example of jungle fever. Spike Lee refuses to allow for the possibility that there could be meaningful affectional ties between a black man and a white woman, which transcend the sexual. Again, I admit that I'm moved by that argument, that it is theoretically at least possible that there could have been moments where maybe interracial couples existed outside of that formulation. But in any event, the point that I'm most interested in by this passage is this question of the reduction of Sophia. If you're going to make us spend this much time with her, why make it only about this fascination of white and black and not anything more meaningful, especially when she was as much a hustler and involved in the criminal world as Malcolm? In other words, this was, there could have been many more things going on. Fictively recreating the relationship between Malcolm X and Betty Shabazz provided an opportunity for Spike Lee to bring Hollywood cinema a different representation of black womanhood and black heterosexuality. Lee did not rise to the challenge. All his films show darker skinned men choosing lighter skinned black female partners. Malcolm X should have been different. By this choice, as a fair-skinned black male of a darker-skinned partner, Malcolm was disrupting a black politics of desire which reflected internalized racism. Rather than honoring through his representations the significance of his choice, Lee reinscribes the same color cast conventions he exploits in all of his films. Though a Madonna figure in Malcolm X, Shabazz is portrayed as an advocate of women's rights, challenging Malcolm's sexism and misogyny. This portrait falsely constructs an image of black womanhood that would not have been acceptable for female initiates in the Nation of Islam, who were taught not to be manipulative or seductive, to be obedient to male authority. Lee's fictive Shabazz seduces and traps. She reads her man in the bitchified manner that is Lee's trademark representation of heterosexual black coupling. Even though the real-life Shabazz shared with her that she did not argue with Malcolm, no doubt because she was conforming to the Nation of Islam codes of behavior, which were informed by sexist notions of appropriate female behavior, Lee's film portrays them as fighting. Indeed, the most intense scene of the film is their near violent argument. As with all good nanny Madonna figures, the fictional Shabazz fights with her man because she has his best interests at heart. The image is consistent with the way Spike Lee's films depict black marriage. Couples are either fucking or fighting. Like other female characters in Malcolm X, Shabazz must be molded and shaped by Lee so that her character mirrors prevailing stereotypes. Lee's film conforms to racist, sexist iconography that depicts white women as innocent and therefore desirable, and black women as controlling, domineering, therefore undesirable. Had Lee chosen to represent Shabazz as submissive, his film would have challenged Hollywood's stereotypical portrayal of black women as always domineering or as always sexual. Wow. That's fascinating. I thought that was I thought that was a fascinating take. By not portraying Ella Lee, that is Malcolm's sister, Spike Lee, which is another good point. Ella Collins does not appear in the film. We get a fictitious black male character as Malcolm's in prison jailhouse guide, but we don't get the real life portrayal of his actual real life sister, who took on the leadership of the real life organization that Malcolm real life left after he was in real life assassinated. But the OAAU has to be, my argument would be, this is not Hooks' argument. My argument would be that Ella Collins had to be removed because she took over leadership of the OAAU, and we're not supposed to know that the OAAU existed. What Hook says is that by not portraying Ella, Lee is able to create a film that does not break with Hollywood's conventions and stereotypes. In Hollywood's films, the super masculine hero is most often portrayed as a loner, an outlaw, a cultural orphan, estranged from family and society. To have shown the bonds between Ella and Malcolm, which were sustained throughout his life, Lee would have needed to both break with Hollywood representations of the male hero as well as provide an image of black womanhood never before imagined on Hollywood screen. The character of Ella would have been powerful, a politically conscious black woman who could not be portrayed as a sex object. Lee's portraits of black women in Malcolm X mirror the usual stereotypes found in films by white directors. Ella was radical in her thinking about blackness, more of a leader than a follower. To represent her fictively, Lee would have had to disrupt the fiction that politics is a male realm. That fight to end racism is really a struggle between white and black men.
Now listen.
I like that. I like that. And I don't like that Ella's not in the film. So I think that was interesting. So I mentioned on the remix last week that I had found this you know what? I'll save that. You know what? Let me make a note and we'll save that for next week so that let me not just on the fly try to do this right now. Let me see here. So next week I'll make sure to include at some discussion of this Wendy Wolf video I reference all the time, because as the publisher of Manning Marable's book on Malcolm, I think it's very revealing what she says in there. But in this article that I'm going to show you here by Manning Marable. All right, so my point in bringing up the Wendy Wolf thing is that part of my argument, again, as I shared on Friday, was that, and many times at this point, that I had evolved this belief over the last several years without definitive proof that Manning Marable did not see the final version of Alive, A Life of Reinvention. His one of his graduate researchers in the Malcolm X Project, Dr. Russell Rickford, who Dr. Margaret Washington says wrote a really good book on Betty Shabazz back in the early 2000s, which I have not read. But maybe we should get to that at some point. he said, again, that he thought that Marable did see it, that they had actually disagreed some over the politics in Marable's book, and that Marable had just reached a conclusion that some of us struggle with. A little bit in the coda of our collective works, and this is what I think I'm going to do. I'm going to, and maybe I can get him to join us. So I'm going to look at the Wendy Wolf and get Todd's coda back involved, because and see where this can be like a small test of my memory, but because I do remember that when we were preparing for the book, that Dr. Burroughs did go back and read all of Marable's articles in Soul's Journal, and said a little bit to this effect, that the point being that the book about Malcolm, that is his magnum opus and final book, is a departure from Marable's previous years of writing in politics. And I would have to agree that I would have not expected, both in terms of the poor quality of the scholarship of that book on Malcolm X, but also the political shift in that book, I would not have expected that from Manning Marable. So as I was preparing for today and I found this, I almost want to reinvigorate my claim. Again, this is from Cineast, the same journal, again, which I'm probably mispronouncing, from March of 1993, by Manning Marable. Malcolm as Messiah, Cultural Myth versus Historical Reality in Malcolm X. And again, it's a critique of Spike Lee's film. But it's a decidedly, to me, different political frame than the frame he brings in his book on Malcolm. So here he's saying, according to a November 1992 Newsweek poll conducted by the Gallup organization, 57% of all African Americans polled agreed with the statement that Malcolm X should be considered a hero for Black Americans. Malcolm X's greatest popularity was found among African Americans between the ages of 15 and 24, with 84% of those polled agreeing with the statement. So for some of us, again, who remember this time and gave credit to the hip hop community that had not been fully conquered yet, and all the positive references and samples to Malcolm X, that it was the Black youth and the hip hop community that was reinvigorating the X symbol and the hats and the and with a similar kind of energy, not well studied, not well organized, probably, or I think you could argue fairly, but certainly with that same kind of energy of something more militant than what we end up dealing with. When asked the reasons for Malcolm's popularity, Blacks eschewed complex ideological explanations, kind of the point I'm getting at, or theoretical excursions into the history of Black nationalism. 84% replied that Malcolm X stood for Blacks helping one another. 82% responded that the Black leader symbolized a strong Black male, with another 74% indicating that he represented Black self-discipline. With the vast social destruction of our central cities today, with 23% of all African-American males between the ages of 23 and 29 currently in prison, on probation, parole, or awaiting a trial, Malcolm X personifies the ability of an individual to overcome the worst circumstances to achieve personal integrity and leadership. Now, admittedly, this last sentence, I'm not really a fan of that part, because I don't think that's what he doesn't. Anyway, there's something about the individual part of it, or maybe that is correct, that an individual can overcome, but not the collective. And I end up kind of just reading it with my own bias against any tendency that doesn't acknowledge the global political struggle, including the civil rights and nationalist struggles that produced a Malcolm and others. But okay, fair enough. But anyway, in this larger social context that Spike Lee's magnificent yet profoundly flawed film Malcolm X must be. It is in this larger social context that Spike Lee's magnificent yet profoundly flawed film Malcolm X must be understood. Warner Brothers had agreed to finance a 2-hour and 15-minute film at a price of $20 million. Lee wanted an epic-sized 3-hour plus film with at cost exceeding $33 million, going way over budget. The director appealed successfully to Black celebrities such as Oprah, Bill Cosby, and Michael Jordan to finance the shortfall. The final product of Lee's labors and shameless promotion of Malcolm X is simultaneously a triumph of filmmaking and a justification of Baraka's fears and frustration. Oh, sorry. I skipped that part here. Throughout the filming, Black critics such as prominent playwright, poet Amiri Baraka charged that Lee was certainly the wrong person to be charged with the political responsibility for interpreting the life and times of a major Black figure for a mass audience. Many Black activists feared that Lee would focus too heavily on Malcolm X's pre-Nation of Islam career as Detroit Red, and he did, and a street hustler and cocaine user at the expense of a solid political analysis of Malcolm's ideological and personal evolution as a leader. And he did. So again, it's fascinating to me that Marable is pointing this out about what people predicted, and then he ultimately largely agrees, but then he himself does that with his book, A Life of Reinvention. He does the exact same thing, and overfocus on Malcolm as anything other than a militant and brilliant representation of the most beautiful and radical politics of the day. The final product of Lee's labors and shameless self-promotion, Malcolm X, is simultaneously a triumph of filmmaking and a justification of Baraka's fears and frustrations. The film's major strengths begin with the truly outstanding performance of Denzel Washington as Malcolm X, which again makes it more dangerous. Then he goes on to talk more about the quality of the acting, et cetera, and so forth. But the film also falls far short in many significant ways. Lee would have us believe that the Federal Bureau of Investigation began to monitor Malcolm's political activities sometime during his final chaotic months of travel, reflection, and political struggle. Actually, the FBI began its systematic surveillance of Malcolm X more than 10 years earlier, long before he had become a national figure. This is a great point to make, and one I wish he would have continued to emphasize and follow as a through line as he was writing about Malcolm in his magnum opus. In other words, keeping that same political frame. While not trying to balance it out with constant references to the immaturity of Malcolm's radical politics. And to all of his, all of the more sensational and unsupported, salacious stuff. If in fact this was the case, how could then Marable conclude in the epilogue that Malcolm would have actually been in line with the national security state had he survived in defending the United States in been in condemnation and criticism of Al Qaeda? So again, if he had long been a threat to the status quo, then Marable wouldn't have been able to write a book about him that he had written. And he would not have been able to have a Wendy Wolf talk about him, and both in terms of fear, but also in terms of having been redeemed enough in her work, in the work of Marable, for massive promotion and support in this new, at the time, Viking Press product. Malcolm's telephone was wiretapped illegally. His mail was monitored. His movements were carefully charted and followed. The New York City police placed doubled agents, including Malcolm's own bodyguard, inside the Nation of Islam. The FBI also attempted to recruit Malcolm himself to betray Elijah Muhammad's organization in the late 1950s, years prior to the eventual split. Scholars have known for years about all of the police state-style surveillance and illegal disruption by authorities. Why does Lee treat this as a minor episode? Why do you treat this as a minor episode? Eventually, 10 years later, when you're writing A Life of Reinvention. Why does Lee treat this as a minor episode, leaving viewers with the distinct impression that the FBI was at best peripheral to Malcolm's assassination? Is that not exactly what Marable does? The wiretapping scenes in the film's final minutes should have begun before the movie was more than halfway finished. No, it should have happened much earlier in the film, because we should have gotten to Malcolm as Malcolm X much earlier in the film. We shouldn't have had to wait 90 damn minutes before we see Malcolm. And then again, we see where Marable, as others, and as is correct, is critical of the autobiography of Malcolm X, which of course forms a lot of the basis for the film and for a lot of what people think they know about Malcolm. But then again, Marable would, a decade later, recreate the problem, all of the problems that he says are existent in the autobiography. The book is a narrative biography related piecemeal fashion from Malcolm X to Alex Haley over a period of several years. Most of the interviews were given to Haley in the early 1960s, well before Malcolm X had become disillusioned with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Go back and look at our book, A Lie of Reinvention, and I think Sundiata Chajua or Ray Winbush, I think, or both of them. I think who else? But several of our contributors point out in a variety of ways that Marable does pretty much the same thing. The interviews are limited. He doesn't interview Betty Shabazz. He doesn't. That is Marable. So so it's like this. It's odd to go back and have to see this critique of Spike Lee, and almost the seemingly how it seems that Marable and Baraka are on the same team in condemning Spike Lee, but then Baraka ends up condemning Marable for the exact same thing that Marable in Marable's book. Marable writes here, but I would suggest that the ideological limitations of both Haley and Lee keep their interpretations of Malcolm located on safe religious grounds rather than on more dangerous terrain of race and class struggle. My goodness, Manning Marable, you're exactly right, except your book does the exact same thing. With all due respect. In speaking with someone who's obviously no longer here. But Marable's book does the exact same thing. The battle between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm is shown as grounded in personalities rather than in differences stemming from ideology and politics. Elijah Muhammad's sexual misadventures and Malcolm's silencing for his chickens coming home to roost remarks following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy are the principal reasons given for the rupture within the Nation of Islam. But Marable doesn't focus on anything differently in his book. He doesn't focus on ideology and politics as causing the rift. And so much of Malcolm's Pan-Africanism and nationalism and affinity for anti-capitalist politics is demeaned or dismissed as immature in Marable's book. Again, the epilogue is what got me so animated to want to condemn it. The epilogue is telling us of a Malcolm that is no threat to the racial class structure of the society, and one who would have again ended up defending it against outside attack. Malcolm's vision was always fixed on a larger world, moving beyond the Nation of Islam and its focus on spiritual issues. But we don't get that in Marable's book. Such an approach ignores the fact that King broke with the Johnson administration over Vietnam War, embraced the Poor People's March against poverty and hunger and margin. So again, I don't know that Marable's book does anything to fix and heal the false narrative that juxtaposes King and Malcolm. Lee's Malcolm X is an excellent introduction to this magnificent and articulate Black spokesperson for liberation. I do not agree with that at all. But it is also seriously limited in terms of critical interpretation. The filmmaker's goal was to create a cultural icon, but the Black community does not need myths. Amen. To really honor Malcolm X is to extend his political and ideological search to the struggles of inequality, racism, and economic oppression, which define Black liberation today. Black identity and personal dignity require something more than cultural manipulation of symbols without critical content. I mean, again.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
Of course that's bars, but where is that Marable in his own book? That's why I'm still suspicious. I don't know. All right. So another one here, Mary Schmidt's. I really was enjoying this one. I might want to spend more time reading this in its entirety or more carefully. Neoliberal Rewritings of Black Radical Memory and Television Documentary, 1989 to 1995 by Mary Schmidt, Doctorate of Philosophy and Visual Studies, University of California, Irvine, 2019. Skipping ahead here to chapter 2, a chapter that illustrates ways in which memory of Malcolm X is constrained within liberal discourses that dull any radical critique of the U.S., elide any challenge to racial capitalism, and disable the ability to see racial justice as a materially transformative endeavor. It's facts.
Now listen.
Facts. The resurgence of Malcolm's memory in the 1990s emerged across multiple venues, media outlets, from mainstream television to public broadcasting, to art house film, to hip-hop culture, to academia, to mainstream art exhibition, to street protest. This plethora of cultural production signals the vitality of Malcolm's image for this historical moment and the wider contestation over the meaning and utility of his message. Telling you, my generation was bringing him back, and they had to negate that. The 1990s saw an eruption of interest and production in the history and memory of Malcolm X. This resurgence could be seen in television programming, VHS documentaries, and narrative filmmaking, most notably in Spike Lee's 1992 film Malcolm X. Malcolm X's autobiography, told by author Alex Haley, saw a 300% increase in sales between the years 1988 and 1991, and a 9-fold increase in Pathfinder publications of Malcolm X's speeches. The proliferation in the 1990s, however, was preceded by a reclamation of Malcolm's memory in hip-hop culture that held much closer to its origins in Black liberation history. Exactly. By the late 1980s, many inner city neighborhoods were decimated, and many of these hip hop artists experienced and spoke truth to power to the overwhelming violence generated by the neoliberal carceral state. Malcolm X provided a history, a grammar, and an image to address and combat U.S. state power and to understand the position and place of Black youth within the longer history of Black struggle. I'm telling you. Then we get Spike's film. He gets the Black bourgeoisie to help finish funding it. Mary Baraka was inclined to classify Lee's film as part of a retrograde trend and referred to Lee himself as a Hollywood hustler. In the end, he accuses Lee of co-opting the history of Black liberation for his own financial gain and branding it to fit neatly within the imperial logic of U.S. global capitalism. As Sohail Dolatsai says, absent in the film were Malcolm's poignant insights into the global nature of white supremacy, the relationship of U.S. empire to European colonialism, and the role of Black peoples in the United States in dismantling racial injustice nationally and internationally, by not exploring how Malcolm situated his criticism of U.S. racism within a broader struggle against white world supremacy. Lee domesticated Malcolm's politics and undermined Malcolm's radical third worldist ideal under the banner of liberal universalism. Again.
Now listen, that's called my boy.
Again. So this is where I got the idea to read those cineast articles, because they're mentioned in here as a collection of critiques coming from Manning Marable, Herb Boyd, Bell Hooks, and others. And however, the critical note is couched by recognition that such a film would even been contemplated, and going so far as to claim how dramatically Spike Lee has expanded the cinematic horizons of Hollywood, is how they concluded the special edition of that journal. But this was a complete misreading. The idea that it expanded the cinematic horizons of Hollywood, unless you want to say they expanded them to be more sophisticated in producing a liberal counterinsurgent version of Black radical history. In many ways, liberal rewritings of radical figures and histories as seen in Lee's Malcolm X actually make it harder to fight the violence of racism by narrowing our political horizons for what anti-racism and freedom can mean and do. Again, that's bars. That's exactly my point. Or it's exactly a point I would want to echo. And again, they caught all the same things that were done not only in Spike's film, but that we argue that Marable would also later do in his book, dull Malcolm X's radical critique of the U.S. and his internationalism. Dull them down. But I really like that recap of the history of the time that produced all this fervor and interest in, or reproduced all this fervor and interest in Malcolm X, that felt organic, certainly, and I think that needed to be met with this level of negation from the state, the bourgeoisie, etc., and so forth. And was that? I thought I had. Was there one more? I guess that was it from here. Yeah, that was all I got from that. But I will now show one more. This Washington Post article from 1991, August of 1991, The Battle Over Malcolm X. Spike Lee versus Amiri Baraka. Who would immortalize the man on film and how? I was distressed he was taking up Malcolm and feared Malcolm would get the same treatment he had given the rest of Black nationalism, said Baraka in a telephone interview from his home in Newark. Malcolm X's life is not a commercial property. It cannot be claimed by a petty bourgeois Negro who has $40 million. This is by Jacqueline Trescott, by the way. Lee, in reply in the Amsterdam News, said, I'm not going to make the kind of film, I'm going to make the kind of film I want to make. And who appointed Baraka chairman of the African American Arts Committee? Lee also wants Baraka to know that Warner Brothers gave him only $25 million for the movie, not 40. So this is all what presaged, right? All of this would have happened just before the panel I'm trying to get Cinque Brath to get me the audio of again, where his father Alombe hosted at the Patrice Lumumba Coalition, Daruba, Amiri Baraka, John Henrik Clark, all talking about the film somewhere after this article would have been written, but before the film came out, because they referenced some of this stuff that Spike said in the press in that panel, including this part about who appointed Baraka chairman of the African American Arts Committee. One of the ironies of the dispute is that Lee last year bitterly criticized Norman Jewison, then the director of the Malcolm X Project, saying the film shouldn't be in the hands of a white director. But that was part of the argument. So as Baraka talks about here on that panel that I'm referencing, they pointed out, and they even raised questions as to whether to what extent Jewison ever had the film, and to what extent it was a concocted criticism from Spike Lee so that he would be given the film. Not so much that a white man had it, but that he didn't have it. And then, of course, that he would do what he did do with the film. Now, this is where one thing I don't agree with the article here is that they say here that the exchange between Baraka and Lee is more than a clash between. Actually, I'm sorry, I misread. I'm sorry, incorrect. It is correct to say that it's more than a clash between generations and approaches. It's a fight over a cultural purpose and racial allegiance. Art should have a social function, Baraka and others have argued since the 60s and 70s. Lee has said he doesn't set out to solve all the problems of the Black community in his material. So that's what they were critiquing on that panel, which you see Lee doing here. On the one hand, Lee is saying, got to be made by a Black man. You can't make a film like this with a white man. But then he's saying, as the Black man with the film, I'm not going to be beholden to the Black community. I'm going to make the film I want. And I also can't be expected to solve all the problems with my film. I would agree with Spike on that, says Alex Haley, who provided the literary spring for most of the treatments on Malcolm X. I think if I were making the film, or if Baraka was making a film, we would like to make the film we had in mind. That is a matter of artistic freedom. My concern is if you are going to attack Lee, attack him after, not before. Well, of course, Alex Haley would say that. Lee went on to say, I will make the best film I know how. There will be no input before we shoot. It is not up for community approval. If they want to know how I will deal with Malcolm, they can wait and pay their $750. Then they can criticize all they want. Yeah, that's I think that's a very revealing approach. That even if you don't like the criticism you're getting from Baraka, the idea that you're doing something that can't be critiqued even in advance, or can't have input even in advance. When again, you're saying, Spike is saying at the time, this is too important a film to let a white man do it. But then he's coming back to say it's not important enough that anyone else but me do it. Baraka went on to say that our distress about Spike's making a film on Malcolm X is based on our analysis of the films he has already made, as we discussed earlier. Their caricature of Black people's lives, their dismissal of our struggle, and the implication of their description of the Black nation as a few besieged buppies surrounded by an irresponsible lumpen is disturbing to the group, said the letter. This was a letter, sent by... So actually, Spike is asking who appointed Baraka, the head of this African American Cultural Committee. He did get a letter that Baraka helped write from the United Front to Preserve the Legacy of Malcolm X and the Cultural Revolution, which was a group of folks that formed, including Baraka, to be critical of what Spike was doing. So there maybe was some sort of election of Baraka. But then Spike Lee wrote, shot back by saying the next week Lee replied and pointed out that in the Amsterdam News that he was 8 years old when Malcolm X was killed in New York in 1965. The filmmaker was then Shelton Jackson Lee. As opposed to Spike Lee. Baraka was Leroy Jones, then living with a white woman in Greenwich Village, and only went running to Harlem after Malcolm was dead. I was 8. What was Baraka's excuse? Yikes. Baraka's reply, this is the cry of a person who cannot defend himself. For him to treat my life like that suggests he is defenseless. Yeah, but yeesh. To me, Lee represents the same trend of Thomas Sowell, Clarence Thomas, Walter Williams. He is able to manipulate popular imagery better than they can, says Baraka. And remember, when this is the author Spike, that Killer Mike held up in juxtaposition to me and said, all right, so there you go. I rest my case. In its analysis of Lee's previous films, Baraka's committee observed, just as we were told that Do the Right Thing would deal with the Howard Beach lynching and Jungle Fever would focus on Yusuf Hawkins' murder, but Do the Right Thing reduced the Black liberation movement to a comic burlesque demanding Black folk flicks in a pizza parlor led by Bugged Out. He would also say that, as Baraka would also say, that Do the Right Thing depicted in that panel I'm talking about, he said Do the Right Thing also showed you what Spike Lee and the Black bourgeoisie do in relationship to Black liberation. They throw the trash can, get the riot started, and then run and hide, and then come back the next day to pick literally the money up off the ground that's thrown at them by white liberals to mollify the community. I thought that was a good critique. When Jewison, the director of A Soldier Story and In the Heat of the Night, was named the director of Malcolm X Project in 1990, Lee was outraged. I have a big problem with Norman Jewison directing the autobiography of Malcolm X, Lee said at the time. That disturbs me deeply, gravely. It's wrong with a capital W. Blacks have to control these films. In a telephone interview, Worth said he did not want to revisit this chapter in the story's evolution. Norm is a friend of mine. This argument should a Black director direct white films? Should a white director direct Black films? Doesn't get us anywhere. Baraka says Lee's attack on Jewison was misleading. When Spike was wrestling the film away from Norman Jewison, he took what was interpreted as a Black nationalist line, but the nationalism he showed was the same kind of nationalism any bourgeois has. He is trying to secure his market. It's just like saying only Black people can sell chitlins. Now, when Spike Lee, again, when he came to Towson University to promote the book some years ago, the film some years ago, I went during Q&A, went up to the mic and said, in response to Spike Lee's speech, which was largely about his career, and then culminating with this call to Black audiences and anyone to support Black films in the first week, because if you don't, they get pulled. Talked about that in relationship to the 5 Heartbeats on Saturday night. And as I said to Spike when I started my question, now that you've told us how to make you money, where is the radicalism in your film? Where is Malcolm's anti-capitalism in the film? And Spike's response to me was he wasn't a Marxist. That was his lines. He said Malcolm wasn't a Marxist. And but he was not interested in any sort of critical discussion of his work. He was just there to promote his work and to tell us how to make sure we make it to the box office on time. Baraka says part of the criticism stems from what he believes was a distortion of the Muslim character in Do the Right Thing. He says, look at Radio Raheem. Lee quotes that he likes to pay tribute to imagery. This Radio Raheem has love in one hand, hate in the other. Am I going to believe Elijah Muhammad is going to be a Radio Raheem? Am I not going to believe Malcolm X wouldn't be Radio Raheem, who was then killed for playing his radio too loud? That is what racist America would like to believe, that Black youth are killed because of something they did. That's bars too, because that's exactly what still goes on. But what did you do? Well, what did they do? And if they weren't doing this, if they didn't have Skittles in their pocket, if they didn't skip school, if they didn't smoke blunts, if they didn't do this, if they didn't do that. Malcolm X's life was a real life. I do not want to see Malcolm's Detroit Red days emphasized, which they are. They should be made to the exact proportion that they existed. I do not want to see the relationship with Elijah Muhammad de-emphasized. It was a critical and important influence, and the film should show at what point they differed. It doesn't really. Is America America going to be ready for a Muslim hero in the wake of Desert Storm? And I remember, because I was in Desert Storm reading about this film being made, and thinking I gotta learn more about Malcolm before I get home and see this movie. For this project, Lee says he has been researching for a year. We have been talking to people who were there with Malcolm. Now that we are doing the film, people are coming out of the woodwork. I get 20 calls a day from my office from someone saying they were Malcolm X's bodyguard. If he had that many bodyguards, he would still be alive today, Lee said on WLIB. Still, I maintain that I am an artist and all final decisions will be mine, end quote. If he had that many bodyguards, he'd still be alive today. Maybe he learned later that Malcolm's told his bodyguards to stand down. Or maybe it doesn't matter because he just wanted to make sure he was not getting any criticism about his movie. So yeah, just wanted to look at a little bit there. I again, wanted to reiterate the amount of scholarship that is out there that references it or has Malcolm as its subject, and that many have recognized in a variety of ways that his popular image needs to be contested and looked at critically because it's been deployed as a Trojan horse to carry in the image of a black radical liberation hero, very neoliberal white conservative politics embedded inside, ready to jump out and get us. And obviously the same thing about the scholarship too. So I'll keep looking at that, and then next week. I'm gonna feature this Wendy Wolf and Dr. Burroughs' coda from our book, and look at and we'll see what else, and maybe look at some more of the scholarship. Maybe we should look at some more reviews of Marable's book. Yeah, maybe go do that anyway. Good people, please do like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon, blackliberationmedia.org, links in the show description. It's been great. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. Please have a wonderful day and the rest of your week. Remixes all week long. Make sure you have the bell rung so you don't miss any of these important offerings. Rest in power, Malcolm X. And energy and strength to those trying to work with all those ideas today that Malcolm so well represented and encouraged. Peace to you, only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say, as always is the case. Salute to the undefeated chat, and I will catch you next time right here with more.
And what do you sacrifice? Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight have set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? Condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything, 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 everything.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.